forget to do your homework, you don't pay attention in class, and you're always in a hurry.
I'm getting frustrated, Jamal.
Don't tell me what to do.
November 14th, 2019. Margaret Whitmore had been teaching third grade for 23 years. She'd seen every kind of cruelty children could inflict on each other, but she'd never seen a grown woman destroy a child's soul in 30 seconds. Linda Hayes stood at the front of room 12, pointing at 8-year-old Marcus Williams. "Class, this is what happens when certain people don't follow instructions." Her voice dripped with venom. "Some children just can't help themselves." Margaret's hand was already reaching for her phone when Linda said the word that changed everything. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be viewed by 6 million people. It would end 2 careers, destroy 1 family, and reveal a connection that had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years. The connection between Margaret's dead daughter and the woman now terrorizing her students. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The slur hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret's phone was already recording when Linda Hayes turned her back to Marcus, dismissing him with a wave of her manicured hand. The 8-year-old's shoulders sagged, his bright Superman backpack suddenly looking too heavy for his small frame. "Mrs. Hayes." Margaret's voice cut through the classroom like a blade. 22 third graders swiveled their heads toward the doorway where she stood, her body trembling with barely contained fury. "Step into the hallway, now." Linda's face twisted into something ugly. "Excuse me, I'm conducting my class." The hallway. Margaret stepped into room 12, her phone still recording. "Children, please take out your reading books quietly." The kids obeyed instantly. They knew that tone. Mrs. Whitmore used it when Tyler Morrison brought his father's pocket knife for show and tell, when Emma Chen got cornered by the 6th grade bullies, when someone needed protecting. Linda's laugh was sharp, brittle. "I don't think you understand the situation here, Margaret. I'm the substitute teacher assigned to this classroom today. You have no authority." "I have 23 years of authority." Margaret moved closer, positioning herself between Linda and Marcus, who was now quietly crying at his desk. "I have the authority that comes from giving a damn about these children. Move." The other kids sensed the electricity in the air. Pencils stopped moving. Pages stopped turning. Even the classroom hamster seemed to hold its breath. Linda's eyes narrowed as she finally noticed Margaret's phone. "Are you recording this?" "Every single word." Margaret's thumb was steady on the screen, including what you just called Marcus, including the look on your face when you said it. "I didn't call him anything inappropriate," but Linda's voice had lost its venom, replaced by something sharper. Panic. "I was simply addressing a behavioral issue." "A behavioral issue?" Margaret's laugh was hollow. Marcus asked to use the bathroom. That was his crime, asking for basic human dignity. Linda glanced around the classroom, suddenly aware of the audience. 22 pairs of young eyes watching every move, every expression. These kids would go home tonight with stories their parents would want to hear. "You're taking this out of context," Linda hissed, stepping closer to Margaret. "You don't know what these kids are like. You don't understand the challenges we face with certain demographics." Margaret's finger tightened on her phone. In her peripheral vision, she saw Marcus wiping his nose with his sleeve, trying so hard to be invisible, just like Sarah used to do when the nightmares got bad. Sarah. Her daughter would have been 23 now. Would have been sitting in her own classroom somewhere, protecting kids just like these. "I understand perfectly." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I understand that you're a racist who shouldn't be within 100 miles of children." The word hung between them like a lit fuse. Linda's face flushed crimson. "How dare you?" "Get out!" Margaret stepped forward and Linda stumbled backward. "Get out of this classroom before I call security, before I call the principal, before I call Channel 6 News and ask them if they'd like an exclusive interview about Riverside Elementary's substitute teacher problem. You can't make me leave. I have a contract. Watch me." Margaret pulled out her cell phone with her free hand, never stopping the recording. "Principal Davidson?" "Margaret Whitmore. I need you in room 12 immediately. We have a situation." Linda's eyes darted to the door, calculating distances, escape routes. But she was trapped. 22 witnesses under the age of 9, all of whom would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. All of whom would tell their parents about the mean substitute teacher and Mrs. Whitmore, who stood up for Marcus. "This isn't over," Linda whispered, gathering her purse with shaking hands. "Oh, but it is." Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's very much over." Linda Hayes walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the linoleum like a countdown. At the threshold, she turned back, and for just a moment, her mask slipped completely. The look she gave Margaret was pure hatred, cold and calculating and familiar in a way that made Margaret's blood freeze. But before Margaret could place that expression, Linda was gone, the classroom door swinging shut behind her. Margaret stopped the recording and knelt beside Marcus's desk. "Hey, superhero, you okay?" Marcus nodded, but his lip was still trembling. "Mrs. Whitmore, did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, big ones." Margaret helped Marcus clean his face, her hands gentle but her mind racing. Something about Linda Hayes bothered her, something beyond the obvious racism, beyond the cruelty, something that felt personal. She had no idea that in 4 hours, her phone would start buzzing with notifications, that by tomorrow morning, her recording would have 500,000 views. And she had absolutely no idea that Linda Hayes had been waiting 15 years for this moment. The silence in room 12 felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Margaret remained kneeling beside Marcus's desk, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, while 21 other pairs of eyes watched her every move. These children had witnessed something they shouldn't have had to see, something that would follow them home in whispered conversations and confused questions their parents would struggle to answer. "All right, everyone," Margaret said softly, rising to her feet. Her knees protested, a reminder that 58 wasn't 25, no matter how fiercely her heart still burned. "Let's take a few deep breaths together." She moved to the front of the classroom, past the cheerful bulletin board displaying the students' Halloween stories, past the reading corner where worn copies of Where the Wild Things Are and Charlotte's Web waited in their plastic bins. This room had been her sanctuary for over 2 decades. These walls held thousands of memories, first lost teeth, scraped knees kissed better, proud moments when struggling readers finally broke through, and heartbreaking confidences whispered during recess about troubles at home. "In through your nose," Margaret demonstrated, watching as small chests rose and fell in unison. "Out through your mouth." Emma Chen raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Whitmore, why was that lady so mean to Marcus?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret had fielded difficult questions before, about divorce, death, poverty, abuse, but racism always felt like defusing a bomb with an audience of innocents. Too little explanation left them vulnerable. Too much stole what remained of their childhood certainty that the world was fair. "Sometimes people make very bad choices, Emma. Sometimes they say things that hurt others because they're afraid or angry about things that have nothing to do with the person they're hurting." Margaret chose her words carefully, watching their faces. "What matters is that we don't let other people's bad choices make us smaller or meaner." Tyler Morrison, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, piped up from the back. "My dad says some people are just broken inside." Margaret's chest tightened. Tyler's father was a veteran, a kind man whose own brokenness sometimes leaked through despite his best efforts. She'd seen him at parent conferences, the way his hands shook slightly, how he apologized for things that weren't his fault. "Your dad's very wise, Tyler. But you know what? We can't fix broken people. We can only choose how we treat each other." She moved to her desk, where a framed photograph sat beside her coffee mug. The one Emma had given her last Christmas with "World's Best Teacher" painted in wobbly purple letters. The photo showed a younger Margaret with Sarah, both of them grinning at the camera from their seats on the Ferris wheel at the Delaware County Fair. Sarah had been 7 then, gap-toothed and fearless, insisting they ride every single ride twice. The familiar ache settled in Margaret's chest like an old friend. 15 years, and she still reached for her phone sometimes to text Sarah about her students. Still bought 2 containers of orange juice at the grocery store. Still set 2-place mats out for dinner before catching herself. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Marcus's voice was small but steady. "Are you going to get in trouble for helping me?" Margaret turned back to him, this brave little boy who had endured public humiliation with more grace than most adults could muster. His Superman t-shirt was wrinkled now, his careful morning grooming disheveled, but his dark eyes held something new, a trust that both honored and terrified her. "No, sweetie, I'm not going to get in trouble." She hoped that was true. In 23 years of teaching, she'd never recorded a colleague, never gone rogue like this. But she'd also never watched someone attack a child with such calculated cruelty. The afternoon passed quietly. Margaret read aloud from BFG, her voice steady and soothing while her mind churned. During silent reading time, she helped Jeremy with his math facts and praised Sophia's improving handwriting, all while that nagging feeling about Linda Hayes gnawed at her consciousness. When the final bell rang, Margaret hugged each student goodbye, a ritual she'd maintained despite administrative concerns about liability. These children were her purpose, her reason for getting up each morning, for pushing through the grief that still ambushed her in quiet moments. Marcus lingered as the others filed out toward their buses and waiting cars. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore, for standing up for me. Always, superhero. That's what we do for people we care about." After he left, Margaret sank into her desk chair and pulled out her phone. The video was still there, 47 minutes of raw footage she'd never planned to take. Her thumb hovered over the share button. Once this went out into the world, there would be no taking it back. Outside her window, the November sky was already darkening, bare tree branches sketching shadows across the playground where her students would return tomorrow, seeking the safety she'd promised to provide. Margaret thought of Sarah's laugh, of Tyler's wisdom, of Marcus's quiet courage. She thought of Linda Hayes' cold, calculating stare, so familiar it made her skin crawl. She pressed share. The notification started 20 minutes later. Margaret was grading spelling tests when her phone buzzed once, then twice, then began vibrating continuously against her desk like an angry wasp. She glanced at the screen. 3 missed calls, 17 text messages, and counting. What in the world? She picked up the phone, watching the numbers climb. 43 shares, 67. The comments were flooding in faster than she could read them. Holy shit, good for you. This teacher is a hero. Where is this? That racist bitch should be fired. Kids don't deserve this hatred. Her heart hammered as she scrolled through the responses. The video was spreading like wildfire across Facebook, already jumping to Twitter and Instagram. Someone had tagged the school district. Someone else had identified Riverside Elementary. A local news reporter was asking for an interview. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to process what was happening. She'd shared the video to her personal Facebook page, maybe 200 friends, mostly other teachers and neighbors. How had it exploded like this? Her phone rang. "Principal Davidson." "Margaret, I need to see you in my office immediately." The line went dead. Margaret gathered her things with trembling fingers, her mind racing through potential consequences. Termination, legal action, the end of a career she'd built on protecting children. But even as fear clawed at her throat, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Marcus deserved someone in his corner. They all did. The hallway felt longer than usual, her footsteps echoing off polished floors. Through classroom windows, she could see other teachers packing up for the day, oblivious to the storm brewing 3 doors down. The normalcy felt surreal. Davidson's office door was already open. Margaret knocked on the frame, noting the tight set of her principal's shoulders, the way he didn't look up from his computer screen. "Close the door," he said quietly. Margaret had worked with Robert Davidson for 8 years. He was a good principal, fair, supportive, genuinely caring about both students and staff. But his face now wore an expression she'd never seen before, exhaustion mixed with something that looked like defeat. "Sit down, Margaret." She perched on the edge of the visitor's chair, her purse clutched in her lap like armor. "I've been getting calls for the last hour," Davidson said, finally meeting her eyes. "Parents, district office, reporters. Your video has been viewed over 8,000 times. Robert, I can explain." He held up a hand. "I watched it, the whole thing." His voice was careful, measured. "Linda Hayes shouldn't have said what she said. You were right to intervene." Margaret felt a flutter of relief, quickly extinguished by his next words. But recording a colleague without consent, sharing confidential classroom interactions on social media, Margaret, this creates liability issues I can't ignore. That woman was abusing a child. And now the district lawyers are involved. The union is asking questions. Channel 6 wants a statement. Davidson rubbed his temples. "I have to place you on administrative leave pending an investigation." The words hit like a physical blow. "You're suspending me? It's temporary. Probably just a few days while this dies down." Margaret's phone buzzed again. She glanced down automatically and froze. The caller ID showed a number she'd memorized 15 years ago but hadn't seen since: Ohio State Penitentiary. "I need to take this," she whispered. Davidson frowned. "Margaret, we're not finished." But she was already answering. her hand moving without conscious thought. "Hello? Miss Whitmore?" The voice was official, professional. "This is Warden Patricia Mills at OSP. I'm calling because you're listed as a victim contact for inmate Michael Hayes, doc number 704 8392. The name hit Margaret like ice water. Michael Hayes, the gunman who'd killed Sarah and 4 other children at Brookfield Elementary 15 years ago. The young man whose cold eyes had stared at her from the witness stand while she'd testified about her daughter's final moments. "Yes," she managed. "I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Hayes died this morning of complications from pancreatic cancer. Per your contact preferences, you requested notification within 24 hours. Margaret's vision blurred. The office seemed to tilt around her, Davidson's concerned voice fading to white noise. Michael Hayes was dead. The monster who'd stolen Sarah from the world, who'd haunted her nightmares for 15 years, was gone. "Ms. Whitmore? Are you there? I'm here." Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "There's something else. Mr. Hayes received a visitor yesterday, shortly before he passed. His sister, Linda Hayes. She'd been coming regularly for the past few months." The phone slipped from Margaret's nerveless fingers, clattering against the linoleum floor. In the sudden silence, she could hear Davidson calling her name, could feel his hand on her shoulder, but all she could see was Linda Hayes' face in that doorway, that cold, calculating hatred that had seemed so familiar. Now she knew why. The sister of her daughter's killer had been in her school, targeting the children Margaret had sworn to protect, and Margaret had just declared war without knowing who her enemy really was. Margaret sat frozen in Davidson's chair, staring at her phone on the floor like it might explode. The warden's voice crackled from the speaker, tinny and distant. "Ms. Whitmore? Are you still there?" Davidson reached for the phone, but Margaret snatched it first, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it again. "I'm here," she whispered. You said Linda Hayes was visiting him?" "That's correct. She'd been approved for visits since August. Always came alone, always stayed the full hour." Margaret's mind reeled. August. Linda Hayes had started working at Riverside in September. Did Michael mention why she was visiting? "Ma'am, I can't discuss the content of inmate visits. I just wanted to notify you of his death and provide closure." Closure. Margaret almost laughed. After the call ended, she sat motionless while Davidson retrieved her phone from where it had skittered under his desk. "Margaret, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't answer, couldn't form words around the enormity of what she'd just learned. Linda Hayes wasn't just some racist substitute teacher. She was Sarah's killer's sister. She'd been planning something, watching Margaret, waiting. "I need to go home," Margaret said abruptly. Davidson frowned. "We still need to discuss the administrative leave. There are procedures." "Robert," Margaret's voice cut through his protests. "My daughter was killed 15 years ago. The man who killed her just died in prison. His sister is Linda Hayes." The color drained from Davidson's face. "Jesus, Margaret, are you sure?" "The warden just told me." She gathered her purse with mechanical movements. Linda was visiting him. For months. Margaret walked toward the door, but Davidson's voice stopped her. "Don't do anything rash. This could be a coincidence." "Coincidence?" Margaret turned back, and whatever Davidson saw in her expression made him step backward. She targeted Marcus specifically. "Did you see how she looked at him? How she knew exactly which words would hurt the most?" "Margaret." She knew who I was. She knew about Sarah. The truth crystallized as she spoke. "This wasn't random, Robert. None of it was random." Outside in the hallway, Margaret moved like a sleepwalker past cheerful bulletin boards and student artwork. Other teachers called out goodbyes, but their voices sounded underwater. At her classroom door, she fumbled with her keys, dropped them, fumbled again. Inside room 12, everything looked exactly as she'd left it an hour ago. Marcus's desk still bore the subtle indent where he'd pressed too hard with his pencil during math. The Halloween decorations she'd hung with such care last month seemed to mock her now, paper ghosts and friendly monsters when the real monsters wore professional clothes and substitute teacher badges. Margaret sank into her desk chair and pulled out her laptop. Her hands moved without conscious direction, typing Linda Hayes into the search bar. Social media profiles popped up, but the photos were generic, sparse. Professional headshots and carefully curated posts about education and child development. Nothing about family, nothing about a brother. But in one photo, taken at what looked like a teacher conference, Margaret caught something in Linda's smile that made her stomach clench. It was the same cold calculation she'd seen that afternoon, barely masked by professional courtesy. Her phone buzzed constantly now. Reporters, friends, strangers sharing the video. The view count had climbed to over 50,000. Justice for Marcus was trending locally. But the viral attention that should have felt vindicating now felt like a beacon, drawing unwanted eyes to her life, her students, her carefully constructed walls. Margaret tried to think rationally. Maybe this really was coincidence. Maybe Linda Hayes was just an unfortunate woman, with an unfortunate last name and an unfortunate attitude toward children of color. Maybe Michael Hayes had family members Margaret had never researched, never thought to fear. But deep in her gut, where maternal instinct lived, she knew better. She remembered Sarah's funeral, the way she'd searched the faces in the crowd, wondering if Michael Hayes had family who blamed her for testifying. She'd received letters during the trial, angry, threatening missives from people who thought she was lying, exaggerating, seeking attention. The FBI had investigated the worst ones, but most had been dismissed as harmless venting from disturbed individuals. What if they hadn't been harmless? What if someone had been watching, waiting, planning revenge not against Margaret directly, but against the children she'd devoted her life to protecting? Margaret's chest tightened as another possibility hit her. If Linda knew about Sarah, what else did she know? About Margaret's routines, her students, her carefully guarded private life? Outside her classroom window, the November darkness was complete now. The parking lot stretched empty except for her car and the maintenance crew's van. Somewhere out there, Linda Hayes was planning her next move. And Margaret had just handed her the perfect excuse to claim victim status, to spin a story about an unhinged teacher attacking an innocent substitute. Margaret locked her classroom door and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every corner held potential threat. She'd thought she was protecting Marcus. Instead, she might have painted a target on them all. The parking lot felt like a trap. Margaret's footsteps echoed against the November silence as she approached her Honda, keys clutched so tightly the metal bit into her palm. Every instinct screamed that she was being watched, but when she spun around, scanning the shadows between the portable classrooms and maintenance sheds, she found nothing but her own paranoia staring back. Inside her car, she locked the doors immediately and sat trembling in the driver's seat. The engine turned over on the third try, her hands shaking too badly to hold the key steady. As she pulled out of the lot, her phone erupted again, another barrage of notifications from the video that had taken on a life of its own. Margaret drove the familiar route home on autopilot, but instead of the usual comfort of routine, every turn felt wrong. The house she'd lived in for 8 years, the one she'd bought after finally accepting that Sarah would never come home, looked different somehow, vulnerable. The porch light she'd forgotten to turn on cast no welcoming glow, leaving the front steps shrouded in darkness. Inside, the silence pressed against her like a physical weight. Margaret had grown accustomed to living alone, had even found peace in the quiet evenings spent grading papers and planning lessons. But tonight, the emptiness felt malevolent. She moved through her house, turning on every light, checking locks she'd already checked, drawing curtains that had never been drawn. In her study, Sarah's old bedroom that she'd converted years ago, but still couldn't quite think of as fully hers, Margaret pulled out a banker's box she hadn't opened in a decade. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid, releasing the smell of old paper and grief carefully preserved. The trial documents were all there, meticulously organized by her younger self who'd believed that keeping perfect records would somehow make the horror make sense. Police reports, witness statements, FBI correspondence about the threatening letters, and there, in a manila folder marked Hayes family, was information she'd never wanted to see again. Michael Hayes had been 19 when he'd walked into Brookfield Elementary with his father's hunting rifle. Diagnosed with severe depression and antisocial personality disorder, but deemed competent to stand trial. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 12, leaving him in the care of his older sister, Linda Hayes, then 26. Margaret's vision blurred as she read her own handwritten notes from 15 years ago. Linda Hayes had attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row behind her brother, staring at the witnesses with unconcealed hatred. Margaret remembered those eyes now, cold, calculating, promising retribution. How had she forgotten? How had she allowed herself to file away that face, that name, that threat? The answer sat heavy in her chest, because remembering would have meant living in constant fear. and she'd had 24 third graders depending on her to show up every day. She'd chosen survival over vigilance, healing over paranoia. It had seemed like the healthy choice. Now it felt like the most dangerous mistake of her life. Margaret's laptop screen glowed as she searched deeper, following digital breadcrumbs that painted a picture of systematic planning. Linda Hayes had substitute teaching credentials in 3 different school districts. She'd worked sporadically over the past 5 years, never staying anywhere long enough to raise questions. But when Margaret cross-referenced the schools with her own trial testimony list, the other witnesses, the other families who'd spoken against Michael Hayes, a pattern emerged that made her stomach turn to ice. Linda had worked at schools where 4 of the key witnesses' children attended. 4 families who testified against her brother, whose children had been exposed to the woman now targeting Margaret's students. Margaret's phone rang, startling her so violently that she knocked over her coffee mug. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello? Ms. Whitmore? This is Detective Sarah Chen with Columbus PD. I was hoping you might have time to answer a few questions about Linda Hayes." Margaret's mouth went dry. "Questions? We've had some reports from other school districts. Incidents involving substitute teachers that might be connected to your situation today. Would you be available to meet tomorrow morning?" After hanging up, Margaret sat in her too-bright house and understood with crystalline clarity that everything she'd built since Sarah's death was crumbling. The safe world she'd created, the careful distance she'd maintained from her own tragedy, the professional reputation that had taken decades to build, all of it was unraveling because she'd chosen to protect one child from one moment of cruelty. But the worst part, the thought that made her chest constrict with something deeper than fear, was the certainty that Marcus wouldn't be the last. Linda Hayes had spent 15 years planning this revenge, and Margaret had just handed her the perfect justification to escalate. Outside, the November wind rattled her windows like skeletal fingers, and Margaret finally understood that the real horror wasn't what Linda had already done. It was what she was preparing to do next. Margaret didn't sleep. She sat in Sarah's old room surrounded by trial documents and coffee-stained papers until dawn painted her windows gray. When her phone rang at 7:30 a.m., she was already dressed and waiting. "Ms. Whitmore? Detective Chen. I'm outside." Through her front window, Margaret saw an unmarked sedan and a woman in a navy blazer climbing her porch steps. Detective Sarah Chen looked younger than her voice suggested, with sharp eyes that missed nothing as they swept over Margaret's house. "Thank you for meeting with me," Chen said, settling into Margaret's living room. "I want to show you something that might be difficult to see." She pulled out a tablet and swiped through several files. "Linda Hayes has been on our radar for 6 months. We've been tracking incidents across 3 school districts, all involving children whose parents testified in high-profile cases." Margaret's throat constricted. "How many children?" 14 documented incidents. Psychological harassment disguised as normal classroom management. Always careful, always just below the threshold of actionable abuse. Chen's expression darkened. "Until yesterday." The detective turned the tablet toward Margaret. On the screen was surveillance footage from what looked like another elementary school. The timestamp read 6 weeks ago. In the grainy video, Linda Hayes stood over a young girl at a desk, her mouth moving in words the camera couldn't capture. But Margaret could read the child's body language, the hunched shoulders, the trembling hands, the way she seemed to fold in on herself. "The girl is Keisha Thompson," Chen said quietly. "Her mother testified in the Rodriguez hate crime case 3 years ago. Keisha started having nightmares after Linda's visit to her classroom. Stopped eating. The parents thought it was just adjustment issues with the substitute teacher." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "You knew this was happening, and you didn't stop her?" "We suspected, but couldn't prove anything until you gave us video evidence." Chen closed the tablet. "Linda Hayes is brilliant at staying just under the radar. She never leaves physical marks, never uses explicitly threatening language. She studies her target's psychological vulnerabilities and exploits them with surgical precision. The other families, do they know?" "We're contacting them today." Chen leaned forward. "But, Ms. Whitmore, there's something else. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about your daughter's case." The words hit like ice water. "What do you mean?" Chen pulled out a manila folder, her expression grave. "We reopened Michael Hayes' file after his death yesterday. Found some items in his cell that his sister had apparently been bringing him. Research materials, photos, planning documents." She opened the folder, and Margaret's world tilted. Inside were photographs of her house, her school, her daily routines, pictures taken from a distance over what looked like months or even years, and underneath them, copies of old newspaper articles about the hate crime case that had led to her testifying at Michael's trial 20 years ago. Michael Hayes' shooting wasn't random, Ms. Whitmore. It was targeted revenge for your testimony in the Marcus Williams hate crime case in 1999. Margaret's vision tunneled. That's impossible. The Marcus Williams case was... And then the final piece clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus Williams was the little boy whose attackers I helped convict, she whispered. The 8-year-old who was beaten nearly to death by 3 teenagers. One of whom was Michael Hayes' cousin, Chen confirmed. Marcus Williams grew up, became a teacher himself, married, had children. His son is Marcus Williams, Margaret breathed. My student Marcus, he's the son of the child you saved 20 years ago. And Linda Hayes has been planning this moment for 15 years. The revelation crashed over Margaret like a tsunami. Every careful coincidence suddenly made sense. Marcus being placed in her classroom specifically. Linda Hayes requesting to substitute in room 12. The particular cruelty of her words, designed not just to hurt an innocent child, but to force Margaret into action that would destroy everything she'd built since Sarah's death. Margaret's voice came out as a broken whisper. She wanted me to defend him. She wanted me to make that video. We believe Linda Hayes orchestrated the entire situation to draw you out, to make you vulnerable. Michael's death yesterday wasn't coincidental timing. We think she was waiting for him to die so she could execute the final phase of their plan without interference. Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the window where morning light revealed her ordinary suburban street. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every car that passed, every neighbor walking their dog, every shadow between houses held potential threat. There's one more thing, Chen said quietly. In Michael's cell, we found a letter Linda had written him. One line in particular. She consulted her notes. She wrote, "The children always pay for their parents' choices. You taught me that." Margaret's blood turned to ice. The arrogance of that statement, the casual cruelty, the complete lack of understanding that children were innocent. It revealed everything Linda Hayes really was, not a grieving sister seeking justice, but a predator who saw children as acceptable casualties in her war against the adults who'd wronged her family. Outside, Margaret's quiet neighborhood continued its morning routine, oblivious to the fact that everything had changed. The monster she'd thought she was protecting her students from had been hunting them all along, and Margaret had just given her exactly what she wanted. Margaret stared out at her peaceful street, watching Mrs. Henderson walk her ancient beagle past the mailbox where she'd received Sarah's last Mother's Day card 15 years ago. The normalcy felt obscene now, knowing that Linda Hayes had probably stood in these same shadows, photographing her morning routines, cataloging her vulnerabilities. Where is she now? Margaret's voice came out steady, but her hands betrayed her, trembling against the window frame. Detective Chen closed her folder with deliberate care. We don't know. She didn't report to the district office yesterday after the incident. Her apartment was cleared, out sometime between Tuesday night and Wednesday morning. Professional job, no fingerprints, no forwarding address. She's been planning this exit strategy. Margaret turned from the window, and something shifted in her chest. The paralysis that had gripped her since yesterday was crystallizing into something harder, more dangerous. She's not done. What do you mean? You said it yourself. Linda Hayes spent 15 years planning this. The video going viral, destroying my reputation, that's just the opening move. Margaret moved to her coffee table where the trial documents still lay scattered. She picked up a photograph of Michael Hayes from his sentencing hearing, studying his face for resemblances to his sister. She made me care about Marcus specifically. She engineered that entire situation to make me defend the son of the boy I testified to protect 20 years ago. That's not coincidence, that's poetry. Sick, twisted poetry. Chen leaned forward. Ms. Whitmore, we have protective services protocols. No, the word came out sharper than Margaret intended. You don't understand. This isn't about me anymore. It was never just about me. She grabbed another document from the pile, the list of families who testified at Michael's trial. How many of these families have children in the district? We're checking. Check faster. Margaret's teacher voice emerged, the one she used when a student was about to make a dangerous mistake. Linda Hayes doesn't just want revenge. She wants to prove that the system fails, that the adults who testified against her brother can't protect anyone. She's going to escalate. The detective's phone buzzed. Chen glanced at it and her expression went rigid. We need to go, now. What happened? Marcus Williams didn't come to school this morning. His father called in sick for him, but when we tried to reach the family, Chen was already standing, reaching for her coat. The call came from Marcus's father's phone, but the voice didn't match our recordings from yesterday's interviews. Margaret's blood turned to Arctic water. She has him. We don't know that. I know that. Margaret was moving before conscious thought caught up, grabbing her keys, her purse, the photo of Linda Hayes from the trial documents. 20 years ago, I sat in a courtroom and watched that woman stare at me while her brother was sentenced for killing my daughter. I told myself I was imagining the hatred in her eyes, that grief made people look at witnesses that way, but I wasn't imagining anything. They rushed toward the door, but Margaret stopped suddenly, her hand on the knob. A memory surfaced, sharp and immediate. The letter, she said. What letter? Margaret's mind raced through the timeline. Yesterday, when Linda was leaving the school, she handed Marcus something. I saw her slip him a piece of paper when she thought no one was watching. I assumed it was... Margaret's stomach clenched. Oh God, I assumed it was an apology note. Chen was already on her radio, calling for units to respond to the Williams family address. But Margaret knew they were too late. Linda Hayes had spent 15 years planning this moment, and she wouldn't have left anything to chance. Outside, Margaret's neighborhood continued its morning routine. Children waiting for school buses, parents heading to work, the ordinary dance of suburban life. None of them knew that one of their teachers had just realized she'd spent 3 decades protecting children from monsters, only to discover she'd been delivering them directly into the predator's hands. As Chen's sedan pulled away from the curb, Margaret caught sight of herself in the passenger mirror. The face looking back wasn't the composed educator she'd worked so hard to become after Sarah's death. It was the face of a mother who'd failed to save her own child and was about to fail again. But this time, Margaret thought as the sedan accelerated toward whatever Linda Hayes had planned. This time, she knew what the monster looked like. And she finally understood that the only way to stop a predator who used children as weapons was to become something equally dangerous in response. The point of no return wasn't approaching anymore. Margaret Whitmore had just crossed it. The Williams house sat dark against the gray November sky, its windows blank as dead eyes. Margaret was out of the sedan before Chen had fully stopped, her teacher instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the stillness of the place. No movement behind curtains, no flicker of television light, no signs of the ordinary chaos that should surround an 8-year-old boy home sick from school. Chen caught her arm as she reached the front porch. Miss Whitmore, let us handle this. But Margaret was already seeing the details that 28 years of teaching had trained her to notice. The newspaper still on the front step, the porch light burning in broad daylight, the way the front door sat slightly ajar as if someone had left in a hurry or been forced to leave. She's not here, Margaret said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised her. This is just the beginning. Chen's radio crackled as backup units reported finding the house empty. No signs of struggle, but no signs of normal occupancy either. The beds were made, the dishes cleaned, everything arranged with the careful precision of a stage set. Margaret's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at Chen, who nodded, already signaling for the call to be traced. Hello, Margaret. Linda Hayes' voice was exactly as Margaret remembered from the courtroom. Controlled, intelligent, poisonous, with suppressed rage. I've been waiting so long to have a proper conversation with you. Where is Marcus? Margaret kept her voice level, falling back on the same tone she used with frightened children. Safe. For now. Much safer than your daughter was, certainly. The casual cruelty hit like a physical blow, but Margaret forced herself to remain standing. I wanted you to know that everything you thought you understood about that day was wrong. Sarah wasn't random collateral damage, Margaret. She was payment. Payment for what you did to my family. Margaret gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white. Around her, Chen's team worked frantically to trace the call, but she knew Linda was too smart to make this easy. Your brother made his own choices. My brother was 19 years old and broken by a system that never cared about him. But you were so eager to play the hero, weren't you? So quick to testify against a child whose only crime was loving his cousin enough to defend him. Linda's voice sharpened. You destroyed one child to save another. I'm simply returning the favor. The words crystallized something that had been building in Margaret since yesterday. The careful, professional distance she'd maintained from her own grief, the protective shell she'd built around her heart to keep functioning, it cracked completely. And what emerged wasn't the composed educator everyone expected. It was a mother whose child had been murdered, and who'd been carrying that rage for 15 years. "You want to blame me for your brother's choices?" Margaret's voice dropped to something Chen had never heard before. Soft, dangerous, absolutely uncompromising. "You want to make children pay for adult decisions? Then let's finish this. Just you and me. No more innocent children caught in your sick game." Linda's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, Margaret, you still don't understand. This was never about you and me. This was about proving that heroes don't exist, that the system you believe in fails everyone it touches, that good people like you are just one crisis away from becoming exactly like the people you think you're protecting children from." Margaret looked at Chen, at the police officers surrounding her, at all the official systems that had failed to protect Sarah, failed to stop Linda, failed to see the pattern until it was too late. She understood with perfect clarity what Linda was offering, a choice between playing by rules that didn't work or stepping outside them completely. "You want to see what I become?" Margaret said quietly. "Then tell me where you are." The silence stretched for heartbeats before Linda gave her an address: Brookfield Elementary. The school where Sarah had died, abandoned since the shooting, scheduled for demolition next month. "Come alone, Margaret. Bring the police and Marcus pays for their heroism the same way Sarah paid for yours." The line went dead. Margaret looked at Detective Chen, at the backup officers, at all the institutional protection that had never been enough. She thought of Marcus Williams, 8 years old and terrified, paying for choices made by adults before he was born. She thought of Sarah, who died because Margaret had tried to save another child 20 years ago. She thought of all the children Linda had psychologically tortured, while the system tried to build cases and follow protocols and maintain professional distance. "I'm going alone," Margaret said. Chen stepped forward. "That's not happening." "Yes," Margaret said, with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 3 decades teaching children that some lines could never be crossed. "It is." For the first time since Sarah's death, Margaret Whitmore stopped being a teacher and became something far more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose. Margaret drove toward Brookfield Elementary as November rain began to streak her windshield, each droplet catching the gray afternoon light like tears she'd never allowed herself to shed. The abandoned school emerged from the gloom exactly as she remembered it: red brick and broken dreams, windows boarded over like closed eyes that had seen too much. She parked where the buses used to line up, where she'd once dropped Sarah off for the last time with a hurried kiss and a promise to help with her science project that evening, the promise she'd never kept. Inside, the hallways echoed with 15 years of silence. Margaret's footsteps sounded impossibly loud against the scuffed linoleum, past classrooms still decorated with faded alphabet charts and water-stained motivational posters. The building smelled of mildew and abandonment, but underneath it all, she could still detect the ghost of that elementary school smell: crayons and paste in childhood. She found them in the library, where it had all ended before. Linda Hayes sat calmly behind the old librarian's desk, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture erect. She looked like any other substitute teacher preparing for story time. Beside her, Marcus Williams sat unnaturally still in a small plastic chair, his dark eyes wide with the particular terror of a child who'd learned that adults could be monsters. "You came," Linda said, as if Margaret had arrived for a scheduled parent conference. "I wasn't entirely certain you would. The Margaret Whitmore I studied for 15 years was always so careful, so rule-following." Margaret stepped into the library, her hands empty, her voice steady. "Let him go, Linda. This is between us." "But that's where you're wrong." Linda's smile was gentle, grandmotherly, absolutely chilling. "This was always about the children, about proving that your kind of heroism is just selfishness wrapped in good intentions. You saved Marcus's father 20 years ago and called yourself noble. My brother died in prison and you called it justice. But what did any of it actually accomplish, Margaret? It stopped a hate crime. It created a new one." Linda stood slowly, her hand resting on Marcus's shoulder with false tenderness. "My brother learned in prison that the only way to hurt people like you was to take what you loved most. He spent years planning how to make you pay for destroying our family. And when he finally acted, your daughter died because you'd convinced yourself that doing the right thing didn't have consequences." Margaret felt the rage she'd buried for 15 years rising like floodwater, threatening to sweep away everything she'd built on top of it. But beneath the anger was something else, a clarity she hadn't experienced since Sarah's funeral. "You're right," she said quietly. Linda blinked, momentarily thrown off her script. "You're right about the consequences," Margaret continued, taking a step closer. "Sarah died because I testified, because I believed that protecting one child was worth the risk. And if I had to make that choice again, knowing everything I know now, I'd make it the same way, even knowing it would cost your daughter's life, especially knowing that." Margaret's voice carried the authority of 3 decades spent teaching children about courage, because the alternative, letting fear stop us from protecting each other, that's not a world worth living in. That's the world you've chosen, Linda. The world where children pay for adult hatred. Linda's composure cracked slightly. "Your daughter paid. My daughter was murdered by your brother. Not by my choices, not by some cosmic balance sheet. By a man who chose to kill children because he couldn't face the consequences of his own actions." Margaret took another step, just like you're choosing to terrorize Marcus because you can't accept that Michael was responsible for his own life. For the first time, Marcus spoke, his 8-year-old voice trembling but determined. "Ms. Whitmore, she showed me pictures of my daddy when he was little, when he was hurt." Margaret's heart clenched, but she kept her eyes on Linda. "She's been telling you that this is your daddy's fault, hasn't she? That good people always get hurt?" Marcus nodded, tears starting to fall. "That's a lie, sweetheart." Margaret's teacher voice emerged, calm and sure. "Good people get hurt sometimes because bad people make bad choices. But that doesn't mean being good is wrong. It means being good is the most important thing we can do." Linda's mask finally slipped completely. "You self-righteous." "I'm not righteous," Margaret interrupted. "I'm just a mother and a teacher who's tired of letting people like you steal hope from children." In the distance, sirens wailed. Chin had followed despite Margaret's protests, probably tracking her phone. But it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the way Marcus's shoulders straightened slightly, the way he looked at Margaret with something like trust returning to his eyes. "It's over, Linda," Margaret said softly. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Margaret Whitmore felt something she'd forgotten was possible. Peace with her own choices, and the quiet strength that came from finally understanding that loving children meant accepting the risk that came with protecting them. The sirens grew closer, carrying the promise of an ending that felt finally like justice.